Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. So, you wanted to explore how men and women's roles are changing in society, right? Especially when it comes to being a dad.
It's a hot topic for sure.
Well, we found this super interesting YouTube discussion, and it's from Glitch Africa Studios. It features this pastor, Biodun Oladele, and some pretty strong opinions.
Yeah, they didn't hold back.
Not at all. It's going to be a wild ride, that's for sure. So we're going to break down some of the most interesting points, maybe a little controversial, about fatherhood, faith, and what society expects. You might even find yourself questioning some things you always thought were true.
That's the exciting part of these deep dives, isn't it? New perspectives.
Totally. Okay, so right off the bat, Pastor Oladele comes out swinging, saying most of society's problems, they come from not having enough responsible dads. He even connects it to things like crime.
And struggling churches.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's a huge claim. Expert speaker, what do you think? Is there any evidence to back that up? Like, what are the implications if he's right?
Well, it might sound extreme, but there's actually some research to support parts of what he's saying. Studies show that kids who grow up without dads are statistically more likely to face certain challenges. Things like poverty, behavioral issues, even ending up in the justice system.
Oh, wow. That's
Hmm.
so it's not completely out there then. But is it fair to put all the blame on absent fathers for those problems? I mean, there are so many other factors too, right?
You're absolutely right. It's way too simplistic to say it's all because of absent fathers. You have to think about things like societal inequalities, economic hardship, lack of access to good education. These are all huge factors too. It's like a complicated web, not just one thing.
I see. So it's less about blaming and more about understanding the whole picture, the whole web, and how dads fit into that.
Exactly. And that's what makes this discussion so interesting. It also challenges that classic stereotype of dad as the breadwinner. Pastor Oladele really emphasizes a dad's role as a teacher. A good example to follow, he even calls it an environmental conditioner.
Environmental conditioner. That sounds pretty intense. I remember that. What does he actually mean by that?
He's basically talking about how a dad shapes the atmosphere in the home, like what values are important, what behaviors are okay, even like what kind of language is allowed. Remember that story he told about the aggressive kid in his kid's school?
Yeah, yeah, the one who was just acting out what he saw at home, right?
Right. And it really shows how much a dad's behavior or lack of behavior can affect a child's development.
That story was pretty powerful. It makes you think about the impact, for sure. So it's not just about bringing home the paycheck, it's about setting a good example, creating that positive space at home where kids feel safe and loved and all that. But the expert speaker, what does conditioning actually look like, in real life? And how can dads balance that with, well, working and providing for their families, especially these days when everyone's so busy?
That's a really good question. And that's where things can get tough. It's not just about being physically present, it's about actually being engaged with your kids,
Mm.
spending quality time with them, being there emotionally, guiding them, helping them figure out right and wrong.
I get it. So it's about being present in a way that actually matters, not just like being in the same room.
Hmm.
But how much is too much? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I can already imagine those overprotective parents who want to shelter their kids from everything.
Right, right. You bring up a good point. It's about finding that sweet spot between guiding your kids and also giving them the freedom to figure things out on their own. And Pastor Oladele recognizes that kids are also influenced by things outside the home too. Their friends, people they see as role models, even if you've given them a good foundation at home.
Yeah, that's true. Makes you think about the things that shaped your own life, doesn't it?
Definitely. We're all a mix of nature and nurture, our environment and our own choices, it all plays a part.
Okay, now this is where things start to get interesting. Pastor Oladele says something really bold. He says, society is killing men.
He's basically arguing that men are under a lot of pressure. They're not appreciated enough for what they do, and society just doesn't support them the way it should.
He even says, and I'm quoting him here, the much that men do is not appreciated. Men don't live as long as women do. Everything from the day a male child is born is existing to kill him. Whoa, that's a pretty strong statement, don't you think? I'm not sure I agree with all that.
It's definitely a strong statement. You could even say it's a bit exaggerated, but, maybe he's trying to get people talking about the real challenges men face.
Okay, I see his point. It's definitely worth talking about. But before we get too deep into that, there's something else we need to address. He also says that women are moved by money and weren't in God's original plan.
Yeah, that's where we need to be careful. We're not here to say whether those statements are right or wrong, but we do need to put them in context. He's basing those views on how he interprets the Bible, specifically Genesis and Corinthians.
Right. But people interpret those passages in a lot of different ways,
Yeah.
right? There are tons of theologians and scholars who disagree with him.
Absolutely. It's just a reminder that we need to think critically about these things, especially when it comes to sensitive topics like gender roles and faith. Don't just take things at face value, look deeper, consider different viewpoints.
So, for all of you listening, we want to know, what are your thoughts on this? How do these statements line up with your own understanding of men and women in faith?
Hearing different perspectives is always valuable. It makes us really think about our own beliefs.
I totally agree. Okay, so let's keep going. Pastor Oladele also talks about this whole 50-50 debate in marriage. You know, the idea that both partners should contribute equally to the finances. He's not a fan of a strict 50-50 split. He even tells a story.
About a woman who had to choose between her faith and her husband coming home.
Yeah, exactly. It really highlights the tension between modern expectations and more traditional ways of thinking about marriage and roles.
It definitely does.
So, expert speaker, what does fair even mean when we talk about splitting responsibilities in a marriage? And how much influence do things like faith and societal norms have?
That's such a tough question. There isn't one right answer for everyone. Different couples find what works for them, you know? What seems fair to one couple might feel totally off to another. And yeah, faith and society definitely play a role in shaping those expectations.
Right, so communication and finding that balance together is key.
Absolutely. It's all about being open, respectful, willing to adjust, and compromise.
Makes sense. Speaking of shifting expectations, Pastor Oladele also claims that marriages that revolve around a shared faith are more likely to last. He even throws out a statistic, 67%.
He thinks it's because that shared faith creates accountability to a community, strengthens their values, and encourages premarital counseling.
Interesting. But what about all the divorces we see, even within religious communities? Is he maybe painting too optimistic a picture here?
We have to look at the bigger picture. While some studies do show a link between religiosity and marital stability, it's complicated. There are so many other factors that play into divorce rates. It's not as simple as saying one causes the other.
Okay, so getting married in a church doesn't automatically mean you'll live happily ever after. Got it.
Exactly. It comes down to the individuals, how committed they are, and if they're willing to work through the tough stuff that inevitably comes up in any marriage, no matter where they got married or what their beliefs are.
Makes sense. Now, this next point is a big one. Pastor Oladele argues that the reason divorce rates are up is directly because there aren't enough dads around. He thinks dads are super important for teaching things like responsibility and commitment, the kind of things that make marriages stronger.
He sees that lack of fatherhood as this root cause of problems in society, even the breakdown of families.
I hear what he's saying, but aren't there other things going on too? You know, like societal norms have changed so much, there's more economic pressure. Those things have to affect divorce rates as well, don't they?
Of course, it's never that straightforward. Things like changing roles between men and women having more financial independence, and even how people view marriage itself, those all play a part in divorce rates too.
So it's not fair to say that dads are the only reason for more divorces. It's
Mm.
much more complicated than that.
Definitely. We need to avoid simplifying these big, complex issues.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from absent fathers and societal problems to the role of faith and how expectations of marriage are changing, and we're just getting started. Let's take a minute to let all this sink in, and then we'll jump back in with even more insights from this super interesting conversation. All right, so let's pick up where we left off with this YouTube discussion, shall we? There's just so much to unpack here. It's amazing. One thing that really struck me was how Pastor Oladele linked those rising divorce rates to, well, the idea that there aren't enough fathers around, you know, that whole decline of fatherhood thing. He argues that fathers are really important, like key, for teaching those values of accountability and commitment. And that's what ultimately makes marriages stronger.
He sees a really strong connection there, for sure. And it
Mhm.
goes beyond divorce, too. He thinks this lack of responsible fathers, that's what contributes to so many problems in society, like a domino effect.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. But I still wonder, couldn't there be other things at play here too, like societal norms, economic pressures? Those have shifted so dramatically over the past few decades, haven't they? I feel like those have to play some role in how marriage and family have changed too, right?
You're spot on. We have to look at the bigger picture. Divorce rates are influenced by a bunch of different things, it's true.
Okay.
Evolving gender roles, women being more financially independent now, and even how people view marriage itself, their expectations, all of that's changing.
So it's not just a simple equation of more dads equals fewer divorces.
Not at all. While a responsible dad can definitely help create a stable family, we can't forget about all the other factors and the choices people make.
Right. Okay. Makes sense. Now, remember how Pastor Oladele talked about marriages that are like built around churches, how those have a better chance of surviving? He even gave us that 67% figure.
Right. He credits that to shared values, the support from the faith community, and premarital counseling, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I remember. It sounds good in theory, but then I think about all the divorces that still happen, even within those religious communities.
Mm.
Do you think maybe he's oversimplifying things a bit?
It's tempting to draw those direct connections, but we have to be careful about that. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean one causes the other. You know what I mean?
I do, yeah. It's more complicated than that.
Exactly. Couples with strong religious beliefs might also say come from similar backgrounds or already prioritize things like commitment and family.
So those things, not just religion itself, might be the real reason those marriages do well.
Right. There's always more to the story. Plus, there are so many ways to define what a successful marriage even means?
That's true. What works for one couple might not work for another at all. What's considered a good, happy marriage here might be seen completely differently somewhere else.
Totally agree. It's not about judging or comparing. It's about acknowledging that there are so many different kinds of relationships and what makes them work.
Well said.
Yeah.
Now, this next part of the discussion gets a little sensitive. Remember when Pastor Oladele said that women are moved by money and weren't part of God's original plan? That one made me stop and think.
Yeah, those were some pretty bold statements. Definitely sparked some debate. And it's important to be sensitive here because there are so many different perspectives, especially when we're talking about religious texts.
He's coming at it from a very specific interpretation of the Bible, especially Genesis and Corinthians.
Yeah. And while that might resonate with some folks, it's important to remember not everyone shares that view. Many people, religious or not, believe in relationships where everyone's equal, respected, and has a voice.
It's definitely a complex issue, and there are tons of different viewpoints. It's important to create a space where we can talk openly, respectfully, and learn from each other, even if we don't agree.
I couldn't agree more. Challenging our assumptions and being open to new ideas, that's how we grow. Those tough conversations are often the most valuable ones.
Okay, that's a good point. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about community and shared responsibility. Pastor Oladele spends a lot of time on the church's role in supporting marriages and families. He sees it as like this essential resource for guidance, accountability, and that feeling of belonging, especially for those couples who are struggling.
He believes a strong faith community can really help couples navigate those ups and downs of marriage and parenthood.
But what about those who don't belong to a church or follow any organized religion? Where do they go for that sense of community and support?
That's a great question, and it shows how much we need support systems that are inclusive, accessible to everyone. It's about thinking outside of those traditional institutions and finding new ways to connect and support families. It doesn't matter what their background or beliefs are.
So it could be anything, right? Like neighborhood groups, parenting classes, even online forums or support groups, even just having a close network of friends and family who can listen and help out.
Exactly. It really does take a village. And we can all do our part to create that welcoming, supportive environment for families, especially those who might be feeling isolated.
I love that. It takes a village. So true. Okay, so we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. It's amazing how much there is to talk about. Expert speaker, what really stands out to you from all this? What will you be thinking about later?
For me, it's that these conversations about fatherhood, family, and what society expects, they're complex and always changing. There's no easy answer, and we have to approach these topics with humility and empathy, willing to listen to different perspectives.
I couldn't agree more. And we can't forget that we all have a role to play in creating a world where families can thrive, where kids feel loved and supported, and where men and women feel valued, respected, and free to be themselves.
That's such a beautiful way to put it, and let's not forget to celebrate all the different kinds of families and relationships that exist in the world.
Yes, diversity is what makes life interesting. So as you keep thinking about all of this, we want you to ask yourself, what does being a responsible father actually mean to you? How can we as a society create a better environment for dads? And how can we challenge those old stereotypes and expectations that hold both men and women back?
Those are such important questions. Keep asking those tough questions. Keep those conversations going. And remember, change is possible.
So well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey of exploration and discovery. We hope you'll keep the conversation going, share your thoughts, and challenge us with your own perspectives. Until next time, keep diving deep. Okay, so we're back, and this YouTube discussion just keeps giving us more to think about. One thing that really stuck with me was Pastor Oladele's claim that marriages, if they're centered around a shared faith, have a better shot at lasting. He even threw out that 67% statistic.
Yeah, he's a big believer in that strong faith foundation being like a key ingredient for a successful marriage. He talks about how it brings shared values, the support from a whole community, and the focus on premarital counseling. All those things can contribute to stronger, longer relationships.
It seems to make sense, but then I start thinking about all the divorces you see, even within religious communities,
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if he's oversimplifying things a bit.
It's easy to think that just because two things happen together, one causes the other, but that's not always the case, right?
Give me an example.
Yeah. So take couples who share strong religious beliefs. They're also more likely to come from similar backgrounds, have the same values, and really prioritize commitment and family stability from the start.
So those things, maybe not just religion itself, could be the real drivers behind those successful marriages.
Right. It's always more nuanced than a simple statistic might suggest. And we should acknowledge that there are a ton of different ways to define a successful marriage in the first place.
That's so true. What works for one couple might not work for another, and what's considered a happy, successful marriage in one culture could be totally different somewhere else. It's not about judging or comparing. It's about recognizing that there are so many kinds of relationships and what makes each one work.
I love that. At the end of the day, the most important things are the love, respect, and commitment between the two people.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, now for a part of the discussion that got a little tricky. Remember those statements from Pastor Oladele about women being motivated by money and not being part of God's original plan? I have to admit, that one made me pause.
Yeah, those definitely stood out, didn't they? And it's important to approach these kinds of statements carefully. We have to remember that people see things differently, especially when it comes to religious beliefs and interpretations.
He's drawing on a very specific interpretation of the Bible for this, mostly from Genesis and Corinthians.
Right, and while some folks might agree with that, it's important to remember that not everyone does. Many people, whether they're religious or not, advocate for relationships where both partners are equal, respected, and have a say.
Yeah, it's a really complex issue with so many viewpoints. I think it's crucial to have spaces for these conversations, to talk openly and respectfully so we can learn from each other, even if we don't always see eye to eye.
Totally agree. Challenging our assumptions and being open to new ways of thinking is how we grow. It can be uncomfortable sometimes, but that's often when we learn the most.
I like that. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about community and shared responsibility. Pastor Oladele talks a lot about the role of the church in supporting marriages and families. He sees it as like a vital resource for guidance, accountability, and fostering that sense of belonging, especially when couples hit tough times.
He really believes that strong faith community can make a huge difference. That extra support to help them through the ups and downs of marriage and parenthood.
That makes sense. But what about those who don't belong to a church or follow any organized religion? Where do they find that kind of community and support?
It's a super important question. It highlights the need for more support systems that include everyone. We have to think beyond those traditional institutions and find creative ways to connect and support families, regardless of their backgrounds or beliefs.
So it could be all kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
Neighborhood groups, parenting classes, online forums, or support groups, whatever works. Even just having a solid network of friends and family who are there to listen and lend a hand.
Exactly. It does take a village, and we can all do our part to create a more supportive and welcoming environment, especially for families that might feel alone.
Love that. It takes a village. Okay, wow, we've covered so much ground today. It's amazing. Expert speaker, what stands out to you most from this discussion? What will you be thinking about long after we're done here?
It's that reminder that these conversations about fatherhood, family, and what society expects, they're complex and always changing. There isn't just one right answer, and we need to approach these topics with humility and empathy, really be willing to listen and understand different perspectives.
I couldn't agree more. We all have a role to play in creating a world where families can thrive, where kids feel loved and supported, and where both men and women feel valued, respected, and empowered to be themselves.
Beautifully said. And let's not forget to celebrate all those different kinds of families and relationships out there.
Yes, diversity makes life interesting. So as you continue to reflect on this discussion, we want you to ask yourself, what does it mean to be a responsible father in today's world? How can we as a society support fathers better? And how can we challenge those outdated stereotypes that hold everyone back from reaching their full potential?
Keep asking those tough questions, keep those conversations going. Change is always possible.
I love that. And that wraps up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks so much for joining us on this journey of exploration and discovery. We hope you'll keep thinking about these issues, share your insights, and challenge us with your own perspectives. Until next time, keep diving deep.